Welcome to Mrigashira, a podcast that communicates with communicators. This podcast is a tribute to our fantastic fellow professionals, colleagues, and friends. I'm Charu Raizada, and this podcast is brought to you in association with Digitales. In this episode of Mrigashira, we step into the world of podcasting and understand this digital medium better with Prarthana Sibal, a world-class podcast producer and manager. Prarthana is the head of client services at Pikkal Co, Asia's award-winning B2B podcast agency. From storytelling to interviews, there are podcasts for everything, and if used correctly, podcasting can give your business or your client's business a major boost by ensuring better customer and market reach, showcasing your industry expertise, and forming extensive networks. With a good 23% increase in podcast consumption in India in 2020, Prarthana shares insights with us today on how to use podcasts as a communication channel. Hi Prarthana, thank you for joining us on Mrigashira, a podcast for communicators.
Thank you, Charu. Thanks a lot for having me.
So on today's episode, we have a podcast expert with us, and she's going to help us understand this new kid on the block a lot better. How we could use this new media better in our communication campaigns for brands and businesses. So Prarthana, we would love to understand from you, what does the podcasting landscape look like, especially for India?
So, as you said, it's rightly a new kid in Asia, but actually it has been a booming industry already in the West. And Asia being just a couple of years behind US, we are now seeing everything being picked up, listenership, content creation, may it be B2B or B2C side. And pandemic has obviously accelerated all of this. If we especially talk about India, we have some great data coming out from KPMG's Media and Entertainment report in 2020, which found out that India actually recorded a 29.3% increase in the podcast consumption in the first year of pandemic. So people were actually assuming that, we won't be listening to podcasts just because the travel time has gone down. During the pandemic, people are under lockdown, but there is actually an increase. The reason is people are so tired of just looking at the screens all day with their work from home setup. So during the rest of the time, during the rest of the house chores, that is what they dwell into, some audio content. We also have some stats coming from PwC's Global Entertainment and Media Outlook 2020 report, which has put India on the third largest consumer of podcasts after US and China, with about 57.6 million monthly listeners. So I don't have specific data on whether it's Spotify listeners we're talking about or Apple podcast listeners, but still coming on as the third largest consumers of podcasts, it's not really surprising with the kind of media landscape. India already has a very rich media landscape and a very rich even radio landscape that we have had in last decades.
I understand and I completely agree with you. And who would have thought like a podcast would be such a great growing market? I'll give you an example. I had a job interview and it was a fantastic thing to just listen to a Harvard Business case study for that company. So just imagine some of the perks of the pandemic is that you have so much access to international content and Indian content. So it's fabulous. Clearly, the market for podcast advertising is growing as Indians continue to rediscover their love for storytelling and long form content in an audio form.
Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, India has a very rich, I would say, the power of local language. So there is a lot of, obviously, India has a great, one of the biggest English-speaking markets also. But at the same time, there's a lot of local language content being generated. So Anchor.fm already has 40,000 plus podcasts which are in the Indian local languages, in Hindi obviously being the most popular out of it.
Right. And you've been working closely with B2B businesses on some interesting podcasts. So tell me, why should B2B content marketers or communication experts care about podcasts?
So let's see it in this way. Let's compare B2B podcasts to other media, right? Podcasts have as compared to the other media, podcasts have very high level of self-reported engagement. Social media can be fleeting, can be fake, but podcasts are engaging and real. And obviously, we all know this keyword which is going around, authenticity, right? So podcasts give brands an opportunity to tell their story in their own words in a format which is this authentic and engaging. At the same time, just imagine your listeners are listening to your brand podcast for about, an average business podcast is what, 43 minutes to 45 minutes. A, a listener is listening to your podcast for almost 70% to 80% of your podcast. So you are a brand which is into your listeners or potential customers' ears for that long. So that is the high level of engagement that a podcast can create. Plus, it is great to create thought leadership and even brand awareness for your organization. Unlike if we go towards press releases, webinars, obviously we saw a lot of webinars also, live webinars going on, virtual webinars going on in the last 18 months. But unlike them and even social media videos, podcast content is readily accessible and searchable on the internet for months. So we call, in fact, podcast as the evergreen content. We can even see that I still go back to, as you said, HBR Idea Trust is actually one of my favorite podcasts as well. And I still go back to like 2 years old content and, check out the content there. So it's all about evergreen content. It's all about accessibility, searchability, and what this means for the wider audience for discovery moving forward.
I agree with you. I think there's a certain amount of timelessness attached to podcasts. Would it be fair to say that with direct marketing, email marketing headed for a slow death, for a B2B marketer, podcasts could be of value?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when I speak to my clients, I usually try to understand what is their objective behind starting a podcast, because this is the reason why a podcast can be a success or a failure. If the podcast objective is very nicely aligned with your business objectives, then that is what leads to a successful podcast. So I have found out in my experience that there are 3 main objectives that comes out of it. So it's either awareness, it's acquisition, or it's influence. So awareness being, podcast is great for effective way to actually raise awareness of issues that matter to an organization and to the right audiences. So we have great podcasts which are coming around climate risk, mental health. These are some big issues, and brands are able to leverage on podcasts to create content around it. 1 billion people listen to podcasts every week globally. So unlike, as I shared, unlike other forms of social media where listeners listen, they consume most of the content here. The average YouTube video might have like an attention span of 80 seconds, but with podcasts, 45% of the podcast listeners actually listen to 75% of each episode. So that is a great way to make sure that your message is reaching the right audience. So that is the awareness part. If you are not looking at awareness, but you are in the early stage and what matters to you is actually acquisition, and this can be relevant probably more for the startups and SMEs and founders themselves, who are also going to raise funds soon. So that is where they can use podcasts to acquire new businesses or new investors. The direct application is literally like you invite a client, partner, or prospect to be a guest on the podcast. This creates a very intimate experience because you're having a very deep conversation with your guest for about probably 30 to 60 minutes. Some of the podcasts even go beyond that. But that kind of a podcast is really a good tool to showcase your work to a wider audience. Just the third one, which probably everyone already knows, is influence. So research shows that, podcast listeners are very young, are highly educated, in fact, and they occupy very high level leadership positions also as compared to the average of population. So if you are putting out a message through a podcast, that means your conversations are reaching just the right people you want to target. And this is more towards the B2B side. So awareness, acquisition, influence. If these are your business objectives, then that's why you should be starting a B2B podcast.
Yes, that makes sense. And I think most of the B2B companies have that as their business objective. So starting a successful business podcast is certainly not easy. What are the questions communicators need to ask themselves before developing a podcast concept?
I get a lot of questions from communicators. They sometimes ask me, they have even asked me that we don't have our own content. Should we start a podcast now or not? Some of them might not have any white papers or any other reports backing or any further research. So what I tell them is that, okay, your content actually lies in your people. Having a white paper or research report, that's a bonus. But if you have great speakers within or great leaders within your company, unleash them through the power of podcast. The other part is also you also can find content within your guest. People actually don't leverage or they don't understand the importance of how much their guest can offer, and it should be like more like a partnership between the host and the guest on generating the content together. This is one of the most common questions that a communicator usually asks me, and it also is in their mind before starting the podcast. But they really need to understand and they really need to keep it in their mind that podcast is a very long-term game. So it's not that within 4, and I'm telling it very honestly, it's not like after 4 episodes you're going to see a huge difference in your numbers or you will see your B2B metrics improving just after the 4 episodes. The 4 episodes, which is more like a proof of concept, just treat it like setting up the operations in place and reaching out to your first connections and setting all of that in place and making sure that you are getting the right host around it. After that, all the episodes starting from 5 to 12 to 24, those are the ones where you should concentrate on your growth, growing your audience, right? So this is just like literally building a podcast is very similar to actually creating any kind of a product internally. You need to start with an MVP, get some investors or stakeholders internally, see who all are really involved in the project, and then you talk about growth. So these are the 2 things I would say. Content side, definitely, and at the same time thinking that the podcast is a long-term game that they are getting into.
At the end of the day, when marketers get into direct marketing or email marketing or look at other ways of marketing, and there are no guarantees, right? The conversion rate is very minuscule. And I think podcast that way at least you can play with a whole lot of information. You can create a lot of content, gives you so much more flexibility, right? And, be a lot more targeted with your messages. So I completely agree with you. I think this is something evergreen. It could be repurposed and it could be used around multiple themes and concepts. Any good podcasts, any which inspire, anything you would like communicators to listen to, or any recommendations you have?
So we have some great podcasts that's coming from Asia as well and on Asia as well. But one of the first few podcasts that I listened to for inspiration is actually This American Life. It's a very highly produced podcast and it's very documentary style. So if somebody likes that, then definitely those are the kind of podcasts they should go for. That's coming more from the West. When we talk about Asia, we actually work with UTI International for their podcast, which is actually on India. So it is the host is based in London and the kind of content we are producing is actually on India. So if your listeners are interested, they should definitely check out Inside India. And that is a podcast which will help you delve more into the business side of India, the business side of cricket, Bollywood, business side of different entrepreneurs and their life and how they have evolved over last decades, including how technology and innovation is evolving. So literally how the entire economy is evolving for India.
That's another advantage of a podcast. It knows no boundaries, right?
Exactly.
So, on that note, thank you so much for talking to us. A lot of good information. And I think I do hope that a lot more communicators
explore this medium a lot more and suggest to their clients and help their clients reach out to their target audience through podcasts.
Great. Thanks, Charu. Thanks for all the amazing questions. It was great to be on the show.
Hope you enjoy listening to Mrigashira, a podcast for communication folks. Do share your suggestions and feedback on Mrigashira at digitales.co.in. Have a great week ahead and do not forget to tune in next week. Adios.